1944. The Third Reich is doomed. World War II has consumed man and machine at a rate the German war effort cannot feed. The Allies hold on to southern Italy and are frantically clawing away at defending forces. The war in the Atlantic has failed, and the Eastern Front moves ever westward. Throughout all of this, Allied bombing campaigns are levelling everything in their path, leaving a ghostly apocalypse in their wake. The cities of Hamburg, Dusseldorf, Cologne, and Dresden are some of the hardest hit and show that civilians are often the target as much as anything else. And now, the Allies have just stepped up bombing to soften defences for the upcoming D-Day landings. Things are only going to get worse for those trapped by the war. However, despite the horrific conditions, the German leadership is determined to go down in flames and bring death to as many people as they can while everything burns. The meth, barbiturate, and cocaine-addled Führer refuses to accept the dire strategic position that is Germany's defensive air capabilities. The only hope of many civilians caught in the crossfire are the Wunderwaffen, advanced weapons that are promised to turn the tide of the war back in Germany's favour. Out of this desperate program comes a fighter that will go down in history, an aircraft that will set the airspeed record, an aircraft that could outmaneuver anything else in the sky, but an aircraft that will dissolve the flesh of its pilots alive. This is the story and horrifying chemistry of the Me-163, the world's only rocket-powered fighter. The first sortie flown in an Me-163 occurred in 1944, though the story of this weird little craft goes back much, much further. In fact, Fritz Stammer flew the first successful rocket plane in 1928. Designed by Alexander Lippisch, this craft was little more than a sailplane with a bunch of black powder rockets attached to the tail. However, it showed as an interesting symptom of the Versailles Treaty. You see, the Allies forbade Germany from owning any single-seat powered aircraft, a clause designed to stop the nation from owning any fighters. As a result, scientists and engineers had to think outside the box and look for alternative methods of flight. This included a lot of work going into the development of gliders and rockets. All rocket motors rely on the same basic principle. They essentially use the energy of a combustion reaction to propel material out in a directed stream. Conservation of momentum means that this will propel your craft forwards. When designing a rocket, you want to maximize the amount of energy you get out of every kilogram of fuel. To understand how to do this, we must consider that we're dealing with a combustion reaction, so there are three main requirements. The first is heat. This is fairly trivial once the rocket is going. The second, however, is fuel, and for most rockets, the fuel is basically an explosive. So yes, rockets are more or less a flying bomb, which is why when something goes wrong, it can go disastrously wrong. But again, we need to make the fuel as efficient as possible, so this is why it's so dangerous. The last item is an oxidizer, the most common of which, surprise, surprise, is oxygen, because who would have thunk it? However, there are many, many other chemicals that can fulfill this role, some of which get incredibly nasty. I mean, even oxygen in high enough concentrations is quite dangerous to us, let alone what happens when it gets into contact with something that is more or less an explosive. As the Nazi Party began gearing up for war, two schools of thought developed around which fuel oxidizer mixes would be suitable for a rocket engine. Wernher von Braun, the eventual father of the US space program, favoured burning methyl alcohol with liquid oxygen. This fuel mix would become infamous with the later vengeance weapon, the V2, and more generally this fuel-oxygen mix is what powers most modern rockets. On the other hand, the Walter engine, designed by Helmuth Walter, used a very, very different oxidizer, hydrogen peroxide. At a low percentage of around 2 to 4%, H2O2 has many different uses, such as a disinfectant or as a bleach, and these are the sorts of concentrations you can buy and find around your household. On the other hand, as the concentration goes up, things get significantly more dangerous. And to get an idea of just some of these hazards, let's go to the Safety Data Sheet, or SDS, for hydrogen peroxide. The SDS is basically a document that contains all relevant safety information for various chemicals, and I've used plenty of them across my chemistry studies. Just to list off the hazards, we have may intensify fire, oxidizer, of course, the whole point of being here, may cause respiratory irritation, harmful if inhaled, harmful if swallowed, and of course causes severe skin burns and eye damage. And just in case that wasn't clear enough, corrosive materials are capable of producing severe burns, blisters, ulcers, and permanent scarring. As for the eye burns, well, that could come with permanent eye lesions, including corneal damage and blindness, depending on the concentration. And it doesn't stop there, but I will only highlight one more item. No human information was located for hydrogen peroxide solutions of 20% and greater. The strongest concentration I've ever come across is 30%, and I was, wearing at least some PPE. However, Walter's engines were using a solution of 80% in a mixture known as T-Stoff. At that concentration, it spontaneously ignites organic material, of which humans are kind of made of, and would basically melt the flesh off anyone unfortunate to get splashed by it. The rocket engine relied on this violent oxidizer to provide power. The T-Stoff was mixed with another solution designated Z-Stoff, an aqueous or water-based solution of calcium or potassium permanganates. To give you an idea of just how strong T-Stoff is, when chemists use permanganates, they use them as the oxidizer, not the stuff that gets oxidized, aka the reductant. Whilst Z-Stoff was a much safer concoction, when it was mixed with the T-Stoff, it would decompose violently in a cold reaction to produce steam at around 800 degrees Celsius. This high-pressure steam was then funneled out the back of the rocket engine to produce thrust. Despite the amazing thrust provided by the engine, it only burnt for about 40 seconds. And even though it was fitted to a prototype, the concept was seen as rather useless, and so development of the aircraft based on Walter's engine stalled. Luftwaffe Chief Reich Marshal and opioid addict Hermann Goering dismissed the plane prior to the war as a useless little toy. Goering, however, was perhaps overconfident and did not believe Allied bombers to be a threat to Germany, stating, "No enemy bomber can reach the Ruhr. If one reaches the Ruhr, my name is not Goering. You can call me Meyer." Well, it wouldn't be long before Hermann Meyer would come to see things very differently. As the war progressed, the project was transferred to the Messerschmitt Company and received its designation Me-163. The first prototype Me-163 was completed in early 1941 under the direction of Alexander Lippisch, the man who built the first rocket-powered plane I mentioned previously. The bat-winged aircraft was designed using the engineering prowess developed from the long years Germany spent experimenting with gliders. It could outrun any Allied fighters, though it wasn't meant to get into any dogfights. The purpose behind the Me-163 was as an interceptor. Its role was to take down enemy bombers and use its speed to keep away from any fighters that might be trying to protect them. As the Allied bombing campaigns became more dangerous and destructive, the need for interceptors would ever increase. Early tests were unpowered and showed the little craft had a glide ratio of 1 to 20, which is better than modern hang gliders. As it would turn out, these glider tests, though, would prove to be the closest thing to safe trials the Me-163 and its pilots would go through. Once the rockets were fitted, however, the aircraft very quickly broke all airspeed records and became the first to exceed 1,000 kilometers per hour during a test flight, though this nearly killed the test pilot, Heinrich Dittmar, when the engines cut out. Despite being exposed to minus 11 Gs, nearly 4 times that of an astronaut during takeoff and double what would cause most people to black out, he managed to pull the plane out of a dive and reignite the engine. Despite the dangers such as this, once in the air, the Me-163 was nearly twice as fast as a Spitfire and could outmaneuver anything the Allies had to throw at it. Now that the small craft had proven its potential, EP-16 was formed in the spring of 1942. Fighter ace Captain Wolfgang Späte, with more than 80 kills under his belt, which is about the same as the Red Baron, was given command. Späte was also a glider champion in the pre-war period, a skill that would prove valuable given the Me-163's flight characteristics. The unit set up shop in Peenemünde, a top-secret test site for German Wunderwaffen, and Captain Späte assigned his friend and fellow ace, Lieutenant Josef Poes, as second-in-command. Poes, who was still recovering from an injury at the time, however, was hesitant to take up his role, but Späte reassured him, saying he still couldn't depress the brake pedals, but that wasn't necessary. The Me-163 didn't have any. Despite the tank of liquid death lodged precariously by their feet, the unit began training new pilots, and Späte was amazed at the maneuverability of the 163 in the air, even believing it would help turn the tide of war in their favour. However, this wishful thinking didn't make up for all the other shortcomings of the rocket fighter. Lippisch, for one reason or another, didn't believe in wheels, and the aircraft would take off using a trolley that dropped shortly after. The pilot then had to land using a skid and without any power, and on grass. The test pilot Dietmar broke one of his vertebrae when he stalled the plane during a landing. As it would turn out, he was one of the lucky ones. April 1942 saw the development of the Me-163B. If things weren't already dangerous enough, they're about to get a lot worse. Although delays in manufacturing the engines for the 163 meant that it would be a few months before they would see any testing, it was these engines that attempted to fix the problem of short flight times. The previous models used almost all their fuels just reaching altitude, but still couldn't reach the height of Allied bombers, just a small problem for an interceptor. Employing a new Walter engine, the Z-Stoff was replaced with C-Stoff, a solution containing hydrazine hydrate, methyl alcohol, and water. To say the hydrazine is safer than 80% hydrogen peroxide, though, is like saying it's safer to catch malaria than it is to catch smallpox. It's not going to be fun either way. And if we go to this SDS, we can see a lovely, lovely list of hazards too. Flammable liquid and vapor, well, no surprise there. Toxic if swallowed, in contact with skin, or if inhaled. Causes severe skin burns and eye damage, may cause an allergic reaction, may cause cancer, and very toxic to aquatic life with long-lasting effects. Despite its dangers though, hydrazine is actually a very sensible fuel to use in a rocket motor. It releases a lot of energy per kilogram when burnt, and it is actually still produced en masse today, and is even the fuel that the James Webb Space Telescope is using to keep itself aligned. However, when mixed with T-Stoff, this new hydrazine-containing C-Stoff reacts even more violently. A single drop of either material coming into contact with each other can cause an explosion, and quite often did. To help keep this from happening, specialised trucks were deployed, with T-Stoff being stored in white containers whilst C-Stoff was stored in yellow containers. The trucks were even forbidden from coming within 800 metres of each other. The pilots were not so lucky. The fuel tanks were still kept right at their feet. A single rupture would cause an explosion. The benefit of using C-Stoff, though, was that as oxygen was produced when the two fuels mixed, it could be burnt to provide further thrust. Remember, it's all about getting the maximum power from each kilogram of fuel. This new engine operated hot at 2000 degrees, which made things even more dangerous, but the new B model had a flight time of 8 minutes at full thrust. I have, though, found an American source from the 1940s claiming you could get much longer if you ran the engine in bursts. Though, I can't seem to find anywhere that indicates the Germans ever flew like this. The improved flight time gave the Me-163 enough power to reach incoming bombers and make one, possibly two passes before the engines cut out. However, the range was still extremely limited at around 80 kilometers under ideal conditions. For comparison, the short-range fighter Bf-109 had a range of about 660 kilometers. As a result, a complex radar-guided control system was set up to direct the rocket interceptors towards unseen targets. Under the direction of Major Späte and Lieutenant Pause, testing of the new Me-163B continued throughout 1942, and if the phrase "things got worse" applied anywhere, damn, it applied here. The first test flight with a student pilot ended in his death, and aviatrix Hanna Riesch, a personal friend of the Führer, used her influence to get herself posted as one of these test pilots. It was extremely rare for women to serve in any German armed forces, and she was one of only 3 women to be awarded an Iron Cross, and she was also the first woman to fly a jet. However, despite her undoubtedly incredible skills, a crash upon takeoff smashed her face into the front control panel as the plane dug into the ground and nearly ripped her nose off. Späte forbade her to ever get behind the controls again, and at the risk of sounding like a broken record, she was one of the lucky ones. Peenemünde was also home to several of the other Vengeance weapon programs. This included the infamous V1 and V2, as well as radio and wire-guided bombs. Späte recalled, "Those familiar with the programs knew with secret horror that of all the new weapons, not one was ready for development with our combat forces." A not surprising observation after he witnessed an early test of a V2 heel over on takeoff and then explode, also taking out several tow planes parked nearby. The Me-163 was considered one of these Vengeance weapons, and it too was certainly not ready for deployment, but again, this was not going to stop the Luftwaffe from trying in a desperate gamble to stem the tide of Allied bombers. Testing also found a string of serious problems with the new Walter engine. A combination of Allied bombing and war production being diverted to other projects meant delays continued to plague the program and prevented many of these issues from being addressed. The most serious issue upon startup, small vacuum pockets could form, known as cavitation. As these pockets collapsed, shockwaves are generated, and this proved fatal as it often caused a massive explosion, a problem that would actually never be solved. However, as 1942 became 1943, things began to get even more desperate for the Luftwaffe, and so plans were drawn up to proceed with equipping the first operational units. What was going to stop, or at least severely delay the project, though, was the Allies. They had been monitoring the German projects, and on the 26th of July, they obtained aerial photographs of a bat-winged aircraft. The following month, the RAF sent nearly 600 bombers to hammer the base and forced the project to relocate to Bad Schwitzerlohn. Though, yet again, continued Allied bombings, poor quality control, manufacturing delays, and a severe shortage of Seestoff and the tanks to transport it delayed the unit, now designated JG-400, from becoming operational for nearly a full year. In the meantime, the trainee pilots used what Komets they had to scare any FW-190s that flew over the base. The pilots would engage in mock dogfights and scare off the ever younger 190 pilots. On the 30th of December, Späte heard the familiar drone of fighters overhead, followed by the roar of a Walter engine starting. Pause was taking off as he had done many times before. However, this time, the engine didn't fire for long and cut out abruptly. Then a massive explosion rocked the base. By the time any help could reach the crashed plane, it was too late. When Späte reached the wreck, Pause was unrecognizable despite wearing a protective suit. His right arm was completely missing, and his left arm and head were reduced to puddles of slime. Späte's longtime friend had, like other test pilots, been killed during takeoff. This time, the wheel trolley had hit the ground so hard it had bounced back up and ruptured a T-Stoff line, cutting the engine. Pause was able to turn the aircraft around and head back to the base, but was unable to avoid a radio antenna. His plane hit the ground and after several rolls had exploded when the fuel mixed. He was among the many unlucky ones. The unit finally became operational in May 1944. On the 13th, in an Me-163B, painted red as a tribute to the Red Baron, Major Wolfgang Späte flew the first operational sortie of the rocket interceptor. Maybe foreshadowing what was to come though, it was unsuccessful and Späte returned without a hit on an enemy bomber. The Major had envisaged a chain of Me-163 launch sites so that bombers would be constantly harassed by comet after comet as they breached German airspace. However, this was rejected in favour of placing the unit near the highly valuable synthetic oil refineries at Luna, and Späte was quickly transferred to another unit to fly the Me-262, Germany's jet fighter, and Späte remains the only person to ever fly both aircraft. Although plans were drawn up for units to be set up around other targets in Germany, none became operational in any meaningful sense. But why Luna? Well, during the 1940s, the US produced 80% of the world's oil, South America 10%, and of the remaining 10%, the biggest producer was the USSR. By 1944, there was no hope of the Germans recapturing any of it, and as Romania fell, then eventually Hungary, Germany lost its last viable oil fields, and Luna became one of the only ways for the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine to fuel anything. And the Allies knew it. Although it was one of the most heavily defended sites in Germany, the addition of the Me-163 unit failed to stem the tide of more than 6,500 bomber sorties that would eventually bring all production to a stop. Of the roughly 350 Komets built, a total of only 9 kills by Me-163s were recorded before the war ended. 3 of these kills were from Sergeant Siegfried Schubert alone, who, unfortunately like many before him, died when his Komet exploded on startup. So, why was the fastest aircraft in World War II history such a failure? Well, basically, it could never really hit anything. The Komet was relatively lightly armed, carrying only 2 wing-mounted 20mm cannons. Although these were upgraded to 30mm cannons, this wasn't enough. Whilst only a few rounds from these guns could bring down a bomber, landing these hits was nearly an impossible task. The slow velocity of a bomber compared to the insane velocity of a Komet meant that there was no time to reliably fire the guns into any target. Yes, it turns out the Komet's undoing would be its speed, the characteristic that actually made it so desirable in the first place. Coupled with such a limited flight time, only 1 or 2 passes could be made before the Me-163 had to glide unpowered back to base, often with Allied fighters on its tail. Although, one of the few saving graces was that the brilliant glide characteristics meant most pilots could outrun any Allied fighters even without power. Unfortunately, the extreme unreliability of the Komet's rocket meant that the Allies didn't actually have to shoot many down. Attempts were made to fix this problem though, and one of the more creative solutions was to mount 8 vertically firing 50mm cannons, which were actually connected to a photocell on top of the aircraft. When the Komet was under a bomber, the Shadow would fire the guns. A prototype even scored a kill on its first flight, but like many late war measures, it was too little, too late. The Nazi government had sealed the fate of Germany, and there was little the Bat was going to do to change that. The Komet remains the world's only rocket fighter to ever see combat. Born out of desperation and ultimately a failure, the horrifying chemistry shows the risks to those involved and their determination in one of history's darkest chapters. The story of the bat-winged aircraft also highlights the severity of what the Allies would do to win and the horrors the Nazis would inflict to try and stop it. This has been the story of the Messerschmitt 163. I've been Almost a Doctor, and until next time, never forget.